Okay, the man himself. This is Albert Haworth, standing by the gate of 2 Oxford Avenue down the road there, a house he lived in the entirety of his life. He lived with largely his parents. His mum actually lasted, I think I found out, was 102 when she died. You'll be seeing quite a bit of Clara, his mum. Yeah, I'll tell the story from a very personal point of view, so it's not a regular talk in that sense. I have a lot of affection for Albert and his knowledge and what he did for Litherland heritage, really. That's the way to look at it. This is not chapter and verse, not everything in his life, but it is my best pick of what the man was all about. I had to show this one. It was these, we were dressed as bargees because it was the bicentennial of Leeds and Liverpool Canal, and that's a big event in our society. So we were printing posters and designing logos. But actually, Albert was there as part of this exhibition type thing. We did the boards, got Joe Public in, we all had a natter. We actually did time capsule as well, didn't we? We put a time capsule under one of the milestones along with Leeds and Liverpool. So we did a lot of activity, and it was well worthwhile. You do lots of things like that. But there's Albert in his natural habitat. If David Attenborough was doing a documentary of Albert, he would be commenting, saying, "Here sits Albert at his table with his folders." You haven't seen the folders yet. But that was the way he was. He used to engage history through his materials, principally these famous folders, which were basically just collections of photocopies. They were photocopies because he wouldn't allow the originals out quite sensibly, because people had nicked them. He was eagle-eyed. He'd sit at the table while people looked at them, and he'd say, "No, stop taking that out of there. That's not a good idea." That's actually a good custodianship. That's responsibility. That's what we want more of. He did have this set of folders, which will figure in the story. But I didn't meet him at that meeting. It goes back a few years beforehand to the Litherland History Society, our abbreviation, in 2017. That's the room that we used to have then, which was a lovely room, actually, in the health centre. I always think of it as the town hall. Just above there, and that was the view from our window over Hatton Hill Park. It's precious to all of us. Albert was part along for those kind of early meetings I went to. I'd come back to Liverpool after 30 years away. Once I'd got over the shock, I sort of said, well, what's going on in history-wise? Because I always had the faint reputation of it. Never actually plucked up courage to go along. So I went along and met all these friends and made contributions since, and that's where it all came from. That's where I met Albert. And these are actually just photos from the Society archives. And this is how I remember Albert. But always that roving expert. I noticed when I went there that people kind of were slightly reverential to him. He used to have like the final say on a lot of topics. He'd be quiet and then he'd say, well, actually, you'll find if you check your facts, it's like this. And that was his strength. He didn't barge in or anything like that, but he did relate a good interpretation of the way things were. And as I say, he produced quite a few little guides and things, as well as his folders. I mentioned he was famous for his pictures. Well, this is Ronnie, who was the famous barber of Sefton Street for 30, 40 years. I'd been away for 30 years and said, I need my haircut. So I went to Ronnie and he said, oh, I haven't seen you for a while. Yeah, he says, your hair's growing a bit. I said, I know, yeah. But immediately back into the room in the conversation, and all we talked about was Albert and his photos. You can see it there. The customers used to come in and they'd be staring at various things, but it would be great conversation piece for him as a barber. But he had great respect for Albert. These are the first glimpse of some of the folders which we were talking about. So, they were kind of pretty dog-eared, but they were a collection, not necessarily over-organised, some random bits in there, but just a potpourri of some interesting stuff. And his products, things like calendars and collector's item. I actually bought one of them long before I knew Albert. And I've still got it. At the same time, these were the outputs of the society and probably raised a few bob at the time. That was part of the idea. But he was really famous for his photography, not in the History Society, but in the Litherland Photographic Society, which I've actually been finding out about because I've been doing searches and seeing what he was up to over various years. And the prizes he won. Actually, I'm thinking, there was one prize, which we'll come up to in a minute, which will explain some of the photos I'd found. Anyway, one of the things I noticed about talking, because once you get two photographers talking together, they go on for hours and hours talking about cameras from 30 years ago. And that was actually one of my connections with Albert, is that we were both into photography. So when he used to tell me about his kit, Durst enlarger in his little room up there, Rolly slide projector, Leica cameras, these were just like beyond the scale of what I could afford when I was a kid. And I do remember that I once knew a guy in the Litherland Photographic Society, 35, getting up to 40 years ago, because I went for 2 weeks. And that guy had a Leica. And then I suddenly realized, this is the same guy. But photography was his world. For a lot of his money was spent. This is quality kit. Every slide he did was mostly on Kodachrome film. Now that's £38 a roll now to develop and process for 36 slides. No, it was never cheap. This is Litherland Photographic Society in 1975. 16-year-old. And actually, I only lasted 2 weeks. I said, this is too square, man. This is too old school. So it was very snooty. They used to sort of intellectualize, I guess I'd call it now, the photography. But, it all became about f-stops and not about the subjects. But you can see there, I'm like putting up with it, saying, how long is this got to go on for? But the guy who took the picture, Albert Haworth. And I connected with that because I remember as a younger man. I said, it's the same guy. Anyway, I showed him that photo and he was absolutely made it, because he made a print for everybody. He just took a picture and made a print for everybody. It was only a small society at that stage. And then in same Photographic Society in 1987, this is what I just found. There's loads of these in the Crosby Herald and Bootle Times. This is Albert collecting a prize for the Spectrum Bronze plaque and certificate of merit. Photographers are very cliquey people, and they've got actually very accepting standards once you get them together, because they inspect each other's work, criticise it for its technical merit and things like that. But he stood up to that, and actually some of the photographs I'll show you, he was a very technically gifted photographer, and that's coming from a photographer who does a lot of pictures. But that's him back then, and he was also in Crosby Camera Club, Crosby CC. And this was just a little snippet that I found in the Crosby Herald. Members focus on a subject, or three. Crosby Camera Club has been a hive of activity recently with the second competition of the season. Using the unusual subject of three, the competition was judged by somebody else from another photographic society. And that kind of explained why there were so many pictures of three objects. I found this batch of slides. Everything's in threes. What's to do with it? He was obviously going in for this competition. That was just one of the slides. I couldn't find the one that won, which is the three dandelion heads. That was three chimneys. He'd obviously been trying that theme again and again and again, photographing three. You did win the prize for slides, which must have made him quite happy. This is a little clipping I found that's Albert. There he is. This was in the Liverpool Daily Post. And I won't read it, but the highlights are that he's from Oxford Avenue, and he's got a superb collection of thousands of slides and a photograph of the town 50 to 100 years ago. Well, that was then. That's a lot longer now. And he just basically says all the changes in store in Litherland, and he says he's got about 300 and 400 boxes, none from later than 1918, all English. Okay? So he says, with a good audience, I can't get a word in edgeways. So you see, that just shows you that he was actually a very social bloke. He used to sort of encourage discussion. And he discovered something which was engaging and a lot of people found interesting. So, that's just like a little snapshot in time. But the interesting quote is he's collected slides since 1957. So we're going to go back in time now. But before we do, we're just going to look at a bit of the future. And there's Howard sitting there. There's Howard. Now, identify yourself, sir. This was not only in the folders, but he was actually also went into... Really, wasn't it true? At the time, this was quite an advanced thing to do, to put a photograph album on the web. Year 2000. And nice little story, partly about Howard saying he was born in Bates Cottages and things. Did you ever find those photos? They're still the holy grail. Good photo of Bates Cottages. So if you know of one, well, Don't go to eBay. You will find ready acceptors for that. Yeah. So that was actually the front page, what that looked like at the time. So the basic slides with no stories or anything, but just got it out there. And a lot more people were able to see that because of that site at the time. This is not really for consumption, but this is my reference chart. Whenever I do some historical research, family tree or whatever, I do a years and ages chart. And this just kind of puts in context a person's life. You may wonder what all the colours are for. Well, obviously the blue there is Second World War. So it gives you the idea he was 10, 11 at the end of the Second World War, born in 1934. The other ones are more amusing, I suppose, because they are actually phases of, this is rock and roll, that's beat music, that's punk, album oriented rock, hip-hop. He's seen them all come and go. Shows you the map of his life, right through Britpop up until the point he retired in the year 2000. Yellow is his retirement years. So whenever you find an artifact, what you're always trying to do is map it to a timeline. Not necessarily age, but where it was in his life. That actually helps form collections because clearly people are interested in certain things at some point, not so much at other times of the life. It's very important at this stage just to introduce his mum and dad. Very important in Albert's life, both of them. Clara, his mum, as I say, lasted till 102, and his dad died about 72 or something like that. But came through the war with him as a little boy, lived as a little family in Oxford Avenue there, number 2. And the photographs that have survived actually tell you just how close they were and, you know, how important their values were to him as well. You can't underestimate that. One of the points is that his dad was a matchworks maintenance engineer. And actually, more or less, that's what Albert followed in his footsteps, as I'll come to in a second. At this point, you'll see these little thingies. So this is the first movie I've got, first drop-in movie. So it's really about the photographs that I've found in his collection, the ones that survived, I should say, which are going to illustrate him as a baby, growing up a bit, up to adulthood with his mum and dad. think, as you'll see, he was very close. He used to talk a lot about his mum, the various trips they went on. I didn't have any visualization of that. I was on his mum's side. In his work, he followed in the footsteps of his dad. That Garston works for Bryant and May. As you will all well know, Bryant and May, for many years, was in Leica Road, the massive match factory, which was bombed in 1941. His dad worked there as a maintenance engineer. And actually, when Albert grew up enough, he joined Bryant and May as well and did his entire career there. But that's his main place of work in Garston, so he had quite a journey to go every day, but he told me he never missed a day of work. I can believe it. Albert was a first-hand source for many of the stories of the matchworks. He used to listen intently to stories of the fire raids, obviously, really about the social side of it. They used to do quite a lot of charabanc trips and things at the factory. It seems quite a strong community, despite very early on in the history, the scandal of Fossi-Jaw, but that got all cleared through by the turn of the century. So there's the record for his dad, whose name spelled wrongly, maintenance engineer of the match industry. So that was the factory down in Leica Road. Albert never worked there because he was 7 when it burnt down, but that event really did affect him in his life. Constantly studied the company, the history of it. He had a direct access to a lot of the materials. So I actually suspect that he had an unwritten history book in him. The amount of materials he gathered was far and away sufficient research material for a novel book. There are quite a few books actually on Bryant and May per se, but I think Albert would have brought something quite special. Got them in bits. There's a couple of boxes of them. My intention is to curate them, catalogue them, scan them, but then hand them on to where I think Albert intended it all to go, which is Leica Mission. He did get some of the materials down there, but that was part of the idea. Leica Mission was directly opposite Match Factory. So there's a connection, heritage-wise, there. So these are just some of the materials. Albert was really funny about picking up people's errors, not in an annoying way, but just, this is a poster from the Bryant and May Heritage Trail, and he's saying, he used to put an arrow on it, and he says, this is a mistake, that it says the Matchworks was opened by an unknown match manufacturer. Well, he says, it was well known, it was Collard's. Anyway, that's just an example. There's another movie that I did dedicated to things which were associated with Bryant and May and his life in work, the archive, really. So that was obviously culled from a Bryant and May mini documentary they did when the Garston factory shut down. Back to our hopeful rejoining the main presentation. Did he intend to write a book? Possibly. Lots of notes for it. However, Albert was widely travelled. By 1960s standards, he was extremely well travelled, probably by the virtue of cheap coach tours to Italy and these places. But there's loads of photos of him, standard holiday pictures. But some of them you occasionally say, wow. But, it is true that he was a travelled guy, and 1960 standards and Litherland standards, very travelled. I'll mention a few dates and places. And the question is, how do I know that? Because he didn't tell me about all of these things. They were discovered in the stuff. One of the great things about slides, they always had a processing date on. So unlike, digital files have largely got dates on, but sometimes they're wrong. This one, Kodak used to stamp on the month and the year in 2 numbers. So that gives you the date of when it was taken. And that means that you can take 25 July 64s and put them in order, because you've also got the frame order. So you're able to reconstitute the original slides, which is quite an interesting jigsaw puzzle type thing to do. On the other hand, what is it of? This is much more difficult. At least it used to be difficult, because unless you had encyclopedic knowledge of European architecture, culture, and all that, now you just go to Google Images. Because if you take a photograph such as that one and just open it in your web browser, right-click and search image with Google, it tells you where it is, because it gives you similar examples of that. Say, well, that's definitely the same thing. So what I'm going to just show you are the genuine places, genuine times, or within a month or so, which constitutes, getting towards a useful archive for saying what he did. what should we put in the next video? Faced with the challenge of all of these photographs that Albert took of Litherland, and some of them are not out on the web. I put a few out there, but now not talking about the kind of the postcards and the historical photographs. These are ones he took with his Leica camera as he walked around. And he did walkabouts. You can quite clearly see that maybe as part of his photographic society activities, he'd pick up his camera and he'd follow a certain path. And today you can join the slideshow together. We could have shown one of them, two of them. What I've done is just done a big walk. He didn't do all these on the same day. But anyway, this is really a sample of the kinds of photographs that are in his walkabout series, if we can call it that. Here we go. That's Albert's walkabouts. That's an efficient way of covering a vast number of photographs. What I would say is photography wasn't the only thing in his life. He had a love of trees. He used to photograph them all the time. And Litherland actually inherited quite a lot of wonderful trees. Unfortunately, they've been a lot of them. Not 100% unsympathetic. You know, you have to manage trees because they just wreck everywhere. But look at the road with those mature trees. That's the top end as well by the church. You know, absolutely gorgeous. These are the same trees as those little twiglets in 1930. I should mention how his dad's influence kept coming back in his conversations. He was always showing me his dad's stuff, his books, his toys. He used to make a lot of metal toys from the era. He would have loved the Meccano talk, for example. But look at the intricacy of his dad's work. These were handcrafted clocks. One of the shames was about the way he went. He went suddenly, got in the house clearers and all this stuff went in the skip. He couldn't get anybody to take it in the museums. I was going to take it. My wife said, no. Otherwise, I'd have that in my room at the moment. I do appreciate things like that because they are lost skills. We need skills like that desperately in this country, and we haven't got any. But there you go. That's his dad. And his dad was a very positive influence and powerful shaper of the way Albert thought as well, which is only to his credit. Stuck for time, can't go into everything we used to talk about. We used to go to his house on the way home from work every day. And I'd sit with him for an hour and then say, I've got to go now, go and get me tea. But what we talk about? We used to talk about all kinds of things. We had a common interest in recording. He had an old ferrograph. You still listen to these things. Massive machine. I remember it very well because he said, I don't want that anymore. It was very unwieldy. And I said, okay, I'll sell it for you on eBay. Because silly ferrographs, vintage ferrographs, quite sought after. I think I got about 400 quid for it. It weighed 5.5 stone. It took me back getting it into the parcel. But it went. Philomene, matchbox collecting. He was in a good place for that, wasn't he? So, you know, take me on the journey through all of these different parts of the world. That was sold in Cuba for Castro cigars, things like that. Lover of books, proper old-fashioned dusty books, which you'd never heard of. Space. Now, he used to know about the Hubble Space Telescope, and this is one of later years, you know, when he's like a year to go. He'd talk about the latest in space research. He's still got New Scientist. I think that's fantastic, that he kept up with that part of the world to go into big conversations about space. His love for St. Philip and the mission. You know, he used to tell me that they won't turn the speaker up loud enough for him. He had a real affinity to St. Philip. And of course, I don't know if you know, but he left a significant amount of dosh for that renovation. That was like Albert was behind that. You know, he had a lot of photographs of St. Philip's. I've got thousands of them, all slightly different angle. He felt it was his village church, part of his world. Obviously, his pride to the photography was a frequent conversation. The collection was vulnerable. And I used to ask him, you know, have you got any on this topic? And he'd find me them in the week, give me them, I'd take them, scan them, and bring them back. Unsung expert on many aspects of Liverpool history. He had stacks of books on it and was very knowledgeable. And his folders, of course, it goes without saying. Now we come to the most difficult slide, which is the story of his demise and his passing. We died in 2020, so 4 years ago. If I think back now, the way we were in 2019, it was kind of optimal because he was fit enough to get out and about. That's just a snapshot. I used to take him out in the car. It was like international rescue. It used to take half an hour to get him to the car. But I had this idea that if he's still going to the post office every week, if he's still doing this, I used to get meals for him. And I brought back, I said, yeah, Albert, got you a lovely meal there, you know, Tesco finest. Don't like them. What do you mean? I like the other ones, the pound ones, farm foods. And he forced me to go to the Strand, to Farm Foods, and buy a pack of 6 sausage dinners. But he loved them because he could stick them under the grill and it served his needs. I just went with the flow. He was independent of thought and body still to the very end, almost the very end. And we've got to be thankful for that. We'd walk back to the car, it'd be a half an hour journey going back to the car. But we got him out and he'd had some time, took him to the cafes and things. So that was 2019, pretty optimal for a very, very old person like that. Then, 2020 didn't start well for me. As you can see there, not too well. I got fatty liver disease and started feeling, tired all the time. So tired that I dropped from full-time work to 3 days a week. And then 2 days, then I had to give up work. So sick that I was just basically laying out all the time, like 18 hours a day on the couch kind of thing, not saying anything, doing anything, just with me cat. However, when all that was going on, it was COVID year. And unbeknownst to me, because I wasn't able to see Albert, I phoned him, but I couldn't see him. And I got to a certain point where I just couldn't think, I forgot my own name. I was extremely sick. And I said to my wife, I said, can you phone Albert? I haven't phoned him for what? She phoned the house. A nurse answered and said, don't you know? Yeah, we rushed him in. He's died this morning. And that was a shock for me because I had no chance to say bye or anything. It's COVID. And then I was still didn't have my new liver, but I was still very ill. 6 months later, 6 months after he died, I get a random call from the solicitor, Albert's estate. We're doing the house clearance. Do you want to come across? And I thought, oh, geez, there's all his slides, all his photographs. What am I going to do? And I was desperately, desperately sick that day. I couldn't hardly stand. I know it was only across the road, literally across the road. I was very careful. Got across there, went in the house, which was open door, and just had that terrible, terrible feeling of an empty house. And I looked around for the stuff. There was nothing to be found. And in the bedroom upstairs was a pile of stuff, just piled that high. I went, oh my God, where's the folders? Folders are gone. The folders were actually stored in a box, the top of the landing. And I'd actually written a note on it, do not remove these folders. I said to the solicitor, where are the... Oh, sorry, they've gone. The guys go in there, pitch. And what you see there, I didn't, for privacy reasons, obviously didn't take a lot of photographs. But I just wanted to record the fact that that's really what I found. Just a pile of stuff. No indication what they were. And I was not in a fit state to do anything about it. I went back home, I got a trolley, told my wife all about it, got the trolley and took loads of stuff on, went to the car, just filled the car as much as I could, drove back, went in the driveway. That stuff was piled high in the car for 6 weeks. Just couldn't get out there, just could not move. I gained some strength, just went into hospital, came out again. And I actually managed to shift to my cellar. But stayed there for 2 years. All those photographs were in that badge. I say I haven't still fully catalogued them. There's a lot of stuff that I can't keep hold of because it's just too personal. They're not historic. I think I'd like to preserve some of his trips abroad, like the ones we got there. They're nice. They're period pieces of European travel in that sense. But not a nice ending. However, his memory lives on. This is the point of this talk. His influence lives on. There is a plan to largely take what I've got and make it available in a new website called Litherland History Hunters, which was really a society website. But the idea with that is to provide a proper legacy framework so that we can say what we know about each picture and then move on. The last thing to say is, what's my sources? All the photographs that you've seen are by Albert. I always credit his work. The new website will always have the credit whenever there's a photograph being used, very important. An amazing contribution of one guy walking around with a Leica camera. And, his photographic skills really did pay off for Litherland history. That's just the music I used. Go back to the man at his gate. Didn't really have a chance to say goodbye to him. I have occasional conversations with him, if you know what I mean. He wasn't always, some people think he was a difficult man. I think the word which is made for him is curmudgeon. Curmudgeon is a word, I looked it up just to be on the safe side. You actually put up with some of the difficulties because of the uniqueness that you get from the guy as well. And I think that sums him up. He could be cantankerous, he could be angry, he could turn you away, he could be short-tempered, he could be all these things. But at the end of the day, he was Albert. And that's how I like to remember him. Good guy, did a lot for the community, did a lot for the church. We need more of him, not less. So that's my memories of Albert Haworth.